Hello all, this is Sean Bell reporting for CommonSpace on November 7th in the aftermath of the US midterms. We saw the Democrats take back control of the House while the Republicans tightened the Senate. I'm speaking today with John Leavitt, writer, cartoonist, activist, and member of the Bronx, Uptown Manhattan chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. So a number of its endorsed candidates achieved victory yesterday, including most famously the insurgent Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, at 29 years old, now officially the youngest woman ever elected to the House of Representatives. John, good morning, and thanks for speaking with us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
First, in the cold light of dawn, what's your initial response to the midterms outcome?
My initial response is this was pretty much expected. I wasn't expecting a very big blowout for the Dems, particularly in large ticket races such as the governorships of Texas and Florida. I always sort of maintain that the Republicans would squeak by there using their traditional tactics of voter suppression and gerrymandering in order to, illegally coerce the vote. But what I really want to talk to about as a DSA member is the fact that we won a lot of local races, and it's the small scale races such as House of Delegates, school board members, county commissioners that we're really seeing a huge growth in, because when we started doing electoral work only 2 years ago, the idea was vote in dog catchers, like work at the lowest possible level and then trickle yourself up, and we're seeing that work. So I'm very positive.
That touches on what my first question was going to be, because judging by the DSA's social media this morning, it looks like it was a pretty good night for an organization that has grown rapidly in influence, not just Ocasio-Cortez and Julia Salazar, but a number of judges, state house wins, and DSA-endorsed amendments and propositions, some of which were a housing bond in Texas, community oversight in Tennessee, and limitations on corporate election spending in Massachusetts. But there was also the defeat of California's rent control proposal, and I think early reports indicated LA's Amendment B, which would have allowed for the exploration of a public bank, might go the same way. So, and there are obviously positives for the DSA. Is there, what's the kind of feeling within the organization, do you feel?
Within the organization, it's, progress has been made. We are continuing to celebrate wins. The loss of a lot of things in California really stings, particularly because a public bank would have been one of the ways we could unhitch a lot of our America's dependence on the finance industry. And a public bank initiative would have been a really good way of doing that. Its failure is a big loss, but as I like to mention, we only got into electoral work about 2 years ago, and we're already seeing significant gains among the electorate. In particular, like not only Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also Julia Salazar in the state Senate and other wins in the party. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think our message is going out there, and the big win I feel that no one is talking about is Mark Elrick for county executive in Montgomery County, because that means the county executive of a metropolitan area just outside DC, which has a population larger than some of our states, will officially be like a cranky old socialist, which is kind of cruel.
Absolutely. And Nancy Pelosi has marked the Democrats' qualified victory by making an appeal for bipartisanship, marketplace of ideas. This is a fairly predictable centrist line from someone like Pelosi, and it has even more predictably come in for a good deal of criticism and mockery from the American progressive left. From your perspective, is there any constituency left in America that this is playing well with? Is there a significant demographic of voters left who want to hear about transcending divisions and Republicans and Democrats working together in the age of Trump?
Well, I would say it's not a non-existent demographic, because I've met them, and they're mostly wealthy retirees who have a house in New York and Florida and who believe, Bloomberg would be a good president because he helped lower their taxes. that is Nancy Pelosi's constituency, basically. It does not represent a mass movement, and it also doesn't represent what Democrats are seeing on the ground, because as governorships for Texas and Florida failed, they do receive a shockingly large percentage of the vote and turnout, which means that, areas in state they've basically just abandoned for years are now suddenly viable. And it's always been very important within the organization that we would say that no place is unwinnable, that you should organize everywhere. And we're actually seeing a lot of gains in Appalachia, in coal country. In particular, there's something called the Mountain Party, which is starting to rise up as a viable third-party alternative in Tennessee and West Virginia and Kentucky, which is actually probably more radical than the national DSA organization would be. They kind of want to abolish personal property. It's really wild, and they're winning. So,
and that brings up something you mentioned to me earlier on about defining what the DSA is in comparison to explicit third-party options. And if you'd care to talk a little bit about that, and also about because we had a lot of the traditional warnings from Democratic sympathetic commentators about not voting third party, and it's because for all the traditional reasons that you'll just swing races to the Republicans, which doesn't seem to have materialized. There doesn't seem to have been many Democratic losses because too many people voted Green or Libertarian or so on. So if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I think the takeaway message is that the politicians who pivoted to the center after their primary lost. And I think the real takeaway message is that there isn't a center anymore. It's which side are you on, effectively? And where we saw electoral gains and ballot initiative wins were things that were kind of nakedly progressive or nakedly leftist. When it comes to what the DSA is, and I want to, for your listeners, it is not a political party. It is a political organization. I believe what you would call an extra-parliamentary organization.
Within the context of British politics, probably.
Yeah, I'm trying to, yeah. And it was founded rather explicitly in the 1980s as a way of influencing the Democratic Party, bringing it back toward its leftist ideals. And there's some argument, within the organization whether or not we should still do that. But as I would like to point out, the real win is that influencing the Democratic Party to become further left seems to be working. If you look at data for progress and polling of Democratic electorates, particularly people who don't vote, because I consider that our actual constituency, broad leftist policies are incredibly popular. Medicare for all is popular even in Republican groups. And the light bulb needs to go up over the party leadership's head that times are changing and they need to get out of the hallway, because they can't keep shuffling the same 6 people for leadership over and over. A huge win we got last night was the fact that the Democratic backbench is now full of people, when previously the biggest problem was that within the National Democratic Party, everyone was either 60 or 20. There was no backbench to build of people in order, to present them for larger state level or national level roles. Now we suddenly have a lot more people in the party, and they are increasingly not white, not male, not straight, not cis, and not centrist. And this represents a small but significant change, I think, to national politics.
Yeah, and well, as a kind of example of what you talked about, of the center no longer existing or no longer being a viable electoral strategy, in Missouri we saw Claire McCaskill, whose strategy of focusing on so-called practical issues over ideology was recently praised by the New Yorker as something her party could learn from, and she lost to a Republican challenger.
Mm-hmm.
Some have already held that up as an example of trying to appeal to Republican voters on their terms, as opposed to presenting a distinct progressive alternative is a flawed approach. So you think that's something that's, has lessons for the wider Democratic Party and not just being an example?
Yeah, they have this obsession with, Tim Kaine famously said, we'll pick up Republican suburbanites, and that didn't happen. They don't seem to get that people vote Republican because they like voting Republican.
Yeah, I think the quote was, for every blue-collar voter we lose in Illinois or something, we'll pick up 2 Republican suburbanites, I think was the quote.
Yeah, which is, further proof that they still think it's 1983. It's bizarre. I do not consider Republicans or people who still continue to identify and vote as Republicans as reachable. At this point, if they are still content with what's going on, they are beyond the pale. I consider non-voters to be the constituency you have to vote for, because you have to remember, if didn't vote was a candidate in the 2016 elections, it would have won 48 states. So the important thing is to reach people who feel alienated by the system. The important thing is to, if Democrats were smart, they would go all in on voter suppression and voting rights stuff, because we know for a fact that the electorate is much further left than politicians think it is. And the biggest problem is that votes are suppressed, or it's made difficult to vote, or, one of the huge wins we saw just last night was the reenfranchisement of Florida convicted people. They finally got
1.4 million, I think the figure was.
Yeah, it's larger than the entire state of Maine. Will now have the ability to vote. It's 40% of the adult male Black population in Florida. Like, it's incredible. And I don't know. The unwillingness to play hardball within the Democratic leadership is very troubling. But if they wanted to play hardball, they would start to attack the fact that Republicans only win because they cheat.
Well, 2 questions on that. First of all, because the voter suppression going on within the U.S. Now, at this point, been fairly well documented. Can the U.S. be considered a credible democracy at this point, or is it something that people are working towards?
I would say the establishment of democracy in the United States is a revolutionary idea, because we don't currently have it.
Yeah, it would put a lot of the rhetoric with regards to the state of democracy in anywhere from Russia to Venezuela kind of in context when you see democracy in the US. But and also what you mentioned on the lessons that the Democratic leadership should maybe take. At this point, in the wake of yesterday's results, what about Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senate leader? In the wake of yesterday's results, is his position tenable in the Democratic leadership?
Absolutely not. He has always been a gigantic thorn in the organization's side. His sole ability is that he is able to get a lot of money from Wall Street. He represents the failure of leadership that led us to this position right now. He needs to go yesterday.
And to talk about something even more cheerful, I'd like to talk about some of the big Republican losses. You got the white nationalist-backed Cory Stewart in Virginia, who failed in a Senate run against Tim Kaine.
That was pretty fun.
He has responded by having what press have described as the saddest election night party ever. Apparently the chicken wings were very good. But Stewart, who made the preservation of Confederate monuments a key part of his campaign, could maybe be seen as an indication that Trumpism doesn't necessarily benefit Republicans other than Trump. But at this point, the GOP is kind of in lockstep behind the Trump administration. To what extent do you think, if any, do you think this frames the 2020 presidential election? Does this make it any clearer what approach the Democrats might take to unseat Trump from the White House?
Oh, well, if you want my honest opinion, I don't think they're going to take the right lesson from it. The current party leadership is too entrenched. They're too infatuated with money. They've shown a complete unwillingness to learn the actual lessons that they're being taught from 2016 onward. They refused to learn the lessons of 2012 when they lost a whole bunch of seats. Like, it's They're very old, they're very entrenched, they're addicted to money and power, and they can't see the writing on the wall. When it comes to Republicans, the biggest problem, well, not the biggest problem. A large problem is the fact that they've built up for the last 40 years this very authoritarian mindset within the party where any dissenting voice is immediately crushed. You cannot be a Republican and dissent from the party line. Sometimes like leftists have said like, oh, we should be more like that. And I'm like, no, what we need is pluralism and democracy. A vibrant, authentic movement doesn't have a strict party line. And the Republicans have a strict party line. And right now that strict party line is endorsing Donald Trump, whatever he does. But Donald Trump is like, it's like Peronism. It only benefits him. And it's not going to benefit anyone else. But they can't dissent from that line.
And another notable Republican defeat was the union-bashing Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker.
A genuine delight.
Who was defeated and is presumably now cancelling his victory ham for a smaller, sadder consolation ham. But the
literal cartoon villain Scott Walker, yeah.
The victorious new Democratic governor, Tony Evers, spent much of the campaign focused on attacking Walker's record rather than playing to kind of broader anti-Trump sentiments. Do you think there's a lesson in there kind of regarding focus on state and local issues rather than going with the dominant national discourse?
Oh, yeah. This is something we saw in New York a lot, which I'm most familiar with. New York, which likes to present itself as this big progressive state, but actually has voting laws so bad that they were used as precedent to uphold Jim Crow era voting suppressor laws. In that our governor, Andrew Cuomo, a gigantic rat of a man, all he can do is attack Trump, and he never attacks policies, and he's intensely unpopular. And you see this a lot with national level Democrats. They're trying to use anti-Trump sentiment in order to bolster or support their own base. But when it comes down to it, people don't actually care who's president. What they care about is whether or not they have health care, whether or not they can afford groceries, whether or not they're going to be able to pay off their student loans. People care about material issues more than they care about the drama and pageantry of national politics. And I think a focus on materialist issues and policy will be more than just saying, well, I'm the anti-Trump candidate.
Now, one of the disadvantages of following US politics as part of the international media is you tend to follow a lot of the well-publicized developments while missing out on some of the nuance or grassroots activity or stuff that isn't so well-publicized. You touched on this a bit earlier on, but is there anything from the midterm results or the campaigns that preceded them you don't feel got enough attention?
Well, there was the reenfranchisement of Florida, which is actually, again, a huge deal. It's a very large amount of people who have suddenly regained their voting rights that were essentially stolen from them. There's also, in Louisiana, they had a very unfair law where you didn't need a unanimous verdict to send someone to the death penalty. And that's been overturned. Legalization of recreational marijuana in Michigan is also really big, as people realize like the Colorado experiment is kicking off and now everyone wants that tax benefit. But
it hasn't seen Colorado descend into anarchy yet, so you know.
Yeah, well, they just elected their first. It would be the first openly gay governor. They just elected him. He actually has some art by a friend of mine, so that was really weird for me.
Yeah.
But a big thing is the fact that the New York State Senate, which has been controlled by Republicans since 1903, is now firmly in the hands of Democrats. And we have been sitting on a pile of legislation that we've wanted to get through. Stuff like the New York Health Care Act, which is essentially Medicare for all for New York. One of the biggest climate bills in the country, like the most sweeping reforms, and the New York Reproductive Act, which would enshrine abortion as a right in the state of New York, third largest state, home of the largest city. all of that legislation has been historically blocked by the state Senate, which has skewed Republican, and then our governor invented a caucus to make sure it would always skew Republican, and then there was this huge effort to kick them out, and that's actually shifted over to the Democratic side for the first time in a century. So there's a real possibility of like quite radical change in New York State as a result of that. And another big thing is the county executive for Montgomery County, which is the county just outside DC, where like the majority of people who live and work in DC don't actually live in DC because DC is limited by a border. They live in Maryland or Virginia. He was just named county executive, which makes him the top elected official for this huge area, which is like, you know, if collected together, it would be something like the fourth largest city if it was one thing. And he's a big old cranky socialist who is sponsored by the DC DSA. And he won, and that's pretty exciting. And also there was just like a ton of really small, interesting races that were won very handedly by DSA members in things like local judgeships, school boards, House of Delegates, just, you know, very encouraging stuff, signs that the movement is only increasing. It's not decreasing. The thing that's decreasing is mainstream centralist democratic politics.
Now I was going to move on to my last question in terms of kind of DSA strategy going forward. Is it just kind of continuing with what seems to be working, or is there any kind of adjustments in the wake of the midterm results?
Well, it's a little early. I would, there's a quote by Öcalan I really like, which is that says, "We must use every instrument in our orchestra." Electoral politics and electoral strategy are just one instrument. We are currently ongoing, you know, a gigantic campaign to get people on board with Medicare for all. There's also a large swath of like unionization efforts going on around the country. The Marriott hotel strike, for example, is sponsored by most DSA chapters. And, you know, locally, even things like the Eco-Socialist Caucus, they're doing things like helping to clean up sites in San Francisco and New York that have been stopped by whatnot, and working on like the Million Oysters Project. In terms of electoral strategy, I think we're going with what works, and what works is what we sort of planned about 2 years ago, which is we need to start taking low risk, low level races and build up from there. And that's worked very well. Like occasionally you get something fantastical, like Andrés Ocasio-Cortez, who is just a phenomenon and intensely charismatic, intelligent person. But not spoken about is the fact that we also got the election of Julius Salazar to the New York State Senate, and that proved that we can run a normal election.
Mm-hmm. And
because
also in the wake of Ocasio-Cortez, Salazar faced a lot more, even more intense opposition.
Yeah, it was surreal, the level of opposition she got.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, with Ocasio-Cortez, you could write that off as like, well, you know, she's a shooting star, like she's a meteor that will never be replicated. Whereas with Salazar, who's a much more, I hesitate to say the word normal, but a much more average candidate, we were still able to run her and win. And we were able to run her and win in a state that is incredibly controlled by the Democratic machine. It's called the Death Star, not unironically.
Okay, well, thank you very much for speaking with us, John, and
You're welcome.
all the best to you.